Hercule Poirot and the Guest in the Torn Photograph, Chapter 1. The Torn Photograph in the Dubois Library. The storm broke over Normandy with a sudden roar, and thunder echoed across the hills like funeral drums. Inside Château Dubois, amid the thick stone walls and wine-coloured velvets, a refined soirée was unfolding in honour of the birthday of the patriarch, Monsieur Armand Dubois. The library, with its coffered ceiling and shelves filled with leather-bound books, was lit by crystal, chandeliers, and the glow of a roaring fireplace. The air smelled of cognac, ancient wood, and ill-kept secrets. A small crowd of select guests shared the evening. The elegant Madame Élise Dubois, the host's second wife, Lucien, the taciturn son and heir from his first marriage, Cécile Morel, an artist friend of the family, and Dr. René Gautier, the patriarch's personal physician. Also present were Mademoiselle Odette Lefebvre, governess to Armand's granddaughter, and the photographer Edmond Valin, invited to capture portraits with his large-format camera. Armand Dubois, an imposing man of 73, with incisive eyes and a voice that still dominated the room, was sitting in his favourite armchair when the conversation was interrupted by a trivial and strange accident. "Sacré bleu!" exclaimed Edmond Valin, accidentally dropping a newly developed photograph. The glass of the frame shattered against the waxed parquet floor. Everyone present turned to look. "Is everything all right, Monsieur Valin?" Lucien asked sharply. Yes. It was just this group portrait I took this afternoon." "How clumsy of me!" Madame Élise gracefully bent down to pick up the picture, but remained motionless. The faint smile on her face faded. "Who is that person?" he asked in a low voice. Everyone came closer. The photograph showed the 8 guests in the chateau garden, neatly lined up. But there was a 9th figure, barely visible in the background, among the bushes wearing a dark hat and a blurred face. It wasn't anyone they recognized. "That's not possible," said Dr. Gautier, frowning. "When you took the photo, there was no one else there." Valin paled. "I swear. I checked the frame. There was no one else in the viewfinder." A frozen silence spread between them. And then, as if the night were waiting for its turn to add drama, a shrill scream pierced the air. It came from the east wing. A maid ran into the library, pale as wax. "Monsieur Dubois," he gasped, "in the greenhouse! He's dead!" When the local inspector arrived, chaos reigned. Armand Dubois was lying on the wet tiles of the greenhouse, his neck at an impossible angle. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, but the old man's face was marked by an expression of absolute terror. "An accident. A heart attack, Inspector," Binet muttered as he surveyed the scene. But Lucien's gaze was stony, and Madame Élise was sobbing into a soaked handkerchief. Cécile Morel kept staring out the window. The photographer was trembling, and Odette Lefebvre was murmuring prayers. It was then that Miss Lefebvre, still trembling, uttered a few words that changed the course of the evening. "Someone else was here. This morning, as I was heading out to the garden, I saw a silhouette vanish among the rose bushes. I thought it was one of the gardeners. But he had a cane, and this chateau doesn't have staff with canes." The inspector frowned. "And why didn't you mention it before?" The governess lowered her gaze. "I thought it was a minor detail, until I saw that photograph." That same evening, a telegram was discreetly sent from the local mayor's office in Caen. It read succinctly: Unexplained. Death. Possible intruder in photo. Dubois family. We need Poirot. 3 days later, under a gentle rain and impeccably dressed in his pearl grey coat and black bowler hat, Hercule Poirot stepped off the train at Caen station. An unknown figure in a photograph, and a dead man with a terrified expression, muttered to himself as he climbed into the waiting carriage. My friends, this case promises to be intriguing. And with a slight smile, Belgium's most famous detective headed to Chateau Dubois, where the carefully disguised truth awaited discovery. Chapter 2. Meeting of Suspects. Hercule Poirot's arrival at Chateau Dubois was greeted with a mixture of relief, scepticism, and restrained tension. The carriage dropped him off at the main entrance, where Inspector Binet was waiting, hat in hand, face grave. Monsieur Poirot, he greeted, I'm glad you responded so quickly. My dear Inspector, Poirot replied with a slight bow. A man has died under strange circumstances. A figure appears in a photograph where it shouldn't have, and a governess speaks of a mysterious walking stick. Believe me, I couldn't resist. They walked together down the main corridor, while Poirot examined every detail. The overly clean carpets, the crooked painting by the staircase, the faint scent of chlorine that still lingered in the air. Have you already questioned those present? Asked Poirot. Just preliminary questions. I preferred to leave the bulk of the matter to you. Very sensible. The library had been arranged for the meeting. The 7 present sat there, each in a separate armchair, forming an almost theatrical semicircle. Poirot entered with a measured stride, his gaze sweeping the room like an invisible scalpel. My lords and gentlemen, he said in a calm tone, I am Hercule Poirot. I am here to understand what happened to Monsieur Dubois. I am not the police. I do not wish to intimidate you, but— He paused significantly. I beg you to be absolutely frank with me. Everyone nodded silently, and Poirot began. First he went to Mrs. Elise Dubois, the widow. She was a woman in her 40s, elegant even in her grief. Her eyes were puffy, but her bearing was erect. My husband was a difficult man, but respected, she said in a firm voice. In recent months his health had declined, but not enough to warrant such a change. He had no enemies, at least not that I knew of. Poirot didn't reply immediately, but his eyes fell on the embroidered handkerchief she was holding. Damp, yes, but also with faint dark stains. Ink, perhaps? Then he turned to Lucien, the son, who made no effort to hide his disdain. My father and I, we weren't close. He thought I was weak, that I wasn't up to running the estate, but killing him. She pursed her lips. That's ridiculous. Poirot nodded briefly. Lucien's hands were clean, but one nail looked torn. Cécile Morel, the artist, shifted restlessly when it was her turn. Her eyes were large and nervous. I came here at Elise's invitation. I was painting a portrait of Monsieur Dubois' granddaughter. I had no reason for this. I barely spoke to him. Poirot noticed that she avoided looking at Lucien. Dr. Gautier intervened in a tired voice. The death was sudden, but I didn't see any typical signs of a heart attack. No obvious injuries, either. The face, that expression. It's disconcerting. Odette Lefebvre, the governess, was clutching a rosary. I saw that silhouette, I swear. At first I thought it was Mr. Dubois, but he didn't walk like him. And then the photograph. It was like seeing a ghost, frozen on paper. Poirot approached her. "Do you have a good visual memory, mademoiselle?" "I think so, sir." "Could you draw what you saw?" She nodded, trembling. Finally, Edmond Vallin, the photographer, spoke awkwardly. "I checked everything. The framing, the lighting. There was no one there, I swear. That figure shouldn't be in the image. It doesn't even appear on the original negative. It's as if it printed itself." An icy silence fell over the room. Poirot looked at every face. No one looked at each other. No one breathed naturally. And yet everyone was holding something back. "Thank you," Poirot said gently. "I won't search your pockets or your rooms. I'll search here." He touched his temple, and believe me, it's more effective. At that moment, a servant burst in nervously. "Monsieur Poirot, there's something you must see in the garden, something that was buried under the marble statue." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what was it?" "A cane, sir, old, and with dried blood on the handle." Poirot said nothing. He simply placed his fingertips together and looked towards the window, where the rain was starting again, and inside the tiny grey cells began to work with renewed vigour. Chapter 3. Initial Interviews. The next morning dawned with a thick mist that seemed to cling to Château de Bois like a damp cobweb. The statues in the garden were veiled in mist, and the lawns still bore the traces of the night's footsteps that, until now, remained unexplained. Poirot rose early, as was his custom. After meticulously dressing himself, handkerchief neatly, folded moustache combed with almost artistic symmetry, he asked Mademoiselle Lefebvre to prepare a table for him in the music room to begin his individual interviews. "The setting influences behaviour, mademoiselle," he explained gently. "This room, with its out-of-tune piano and embroidered tapestry, lacks the solemnity of the library. Here, lips are looser." First interview. Madame Élise Dubois-Poirot greeted her, seated with an untouched cup of tea. Madame Élise entered, wrapped in a black chiffon dress, elegant but not overly mournful. "Madam, thank you for your time. I assure you I'll be brief." He paused subtly. "Did you love your husband?" She held his gaze with surprising firmness. "Yes, although sometimes you love someone, and at the same time you wish you weren't tied to them." Tied? Armand could be controlling. He decided everything, even which artist could paint his granddaughter. I wanted to hire someone else, but he insisted on valour. "More discreet," he said. Poirot nodded. He jotted it all down mentally, but not in his notebook. With Élise, spontaneity could be more frightening than a pen. Second interview. Lucien Dubois. Lucien entered with his hands in his pockets and a grimace of impatience. "Will this be long?" "It's up to you, sir. Your father, as I understand it, didn't trust you with the management of the estate. Why? I thought you had no character, that you preferred the city, women, parties. And maybe I was right," he added with a cold smile. "And the cane found in the garden? It's not mine. I don't use a cane." "But his father did have one." "I had 3, collectible ones. I only used one frequently, and that one isn't it." Poirot leaned towards him. "You don't seem very affected by his death." Lucien shrugged. "My father taught me that emotional weakness is a waste of time." Third interview. Cécile Morel. The artist entered with a sketchbook under her arm. She sat down uninvited and nervously crossed her legs. "Are you painting the deceased's granddaughter?" "Yes, or she was trying to. The girl has been traumatized since her grandfather's death. She hasn't said a word. Did you get along well with Monsieur Dubois?" "Not exactly. He didn't trust art. He said it loosened the mind." Poirot smiled slightly. "And you? Who do you get along with in this house?" She looked down. "With Élise, and sometimes with Lucien. But that doesn't mean anything. I have nothing to do with this." Poirot didn't reply. He looked at the notebook. He was carrying. A page with dark lines was sticking out of the corner. A figure in the bushes, a hat. Coincidence? Fourth interview, Dr. Gautier. The doctor appeared with his briefcase still in hand. "What can I contribute that I haven't already?" "Told you. Just details, doctor. The trivial often obscures the essential. Have you noticed any previous ailments in Monsieur Dubois? Just high blood pressure, but well controlled. And medications. He had an anxiety reliever. He didn't take it often. It was in his medicine cabinet. Why do you ask? And now? Is it still in the medicine cabinet?" The doctor blinked. "No, now that you mention it, it's not there. But it could have gotten lost in the chaos, or have been administered without consent." The doctor didn't reply immediately. Poirot let him go without further questions. Fifth interview. Odette Lefebvre. The governess sat up straight, as if at an invisible desk. "Miss Lefebvre, your testimony about the cane was crucial. Are you sure about what you saw?" "Yes, sir. I don't have a good eye for detail, but I remember the way he walked. It was a shuffling gait, and the cane had a golden head. And could anyone else in here walk like that?" She hesitated. "Lucien sprained his ankle a few weeks ago. He walked like that for a couple of days, but he recovered. At least that's what he said." Sixth interview. Edmund Vallon. The photographer arrived last, his eyes sunken and his fingers stained with developer. "Can I show you something, Monsieur Poirot?" Please." He pulled out an enlarged copy of the torn photograph. The face of the figure in the background was still blurry, but something stood out, the cane, and the way the figure leaned forward, as if waiting for something. I don't remember capturing this, but the strangest thing is, he pointed to the bottom edge, there's a minimal double exposure, as if this figure had been printed twice, slightly offset, like a misplaced reflection. Poirot stood up slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Thank you, sir. You've been very helpful." As the room fell silent again, Poirot walked to the window. In his mind, the pieces began to turn like gears. Something didn't fit, or rather, it fit too well. And that, for Poirot, was always the most suspicious thing. Chapter 4. The First False Clue. During the afternoon, Chateau Dubois took on a denser air, as if the house itself were breathing heavily. The curtains remained half-drawn, and the faint echo of aimless footsteps resonated in the corridors. Poirot, with his hands behind his back, and his moustache perfectly symmetrical, walked slowly through the corridors, occasionally pausing in front of a vase, a painting, or a crack in the wall, as if every detail revealed a silent clue. Around 5 o'clock, Inspector Binet returned with news. In his hand, he held a crumpled brown envelope, marked with the Chateau coat of arms. Inside was a wrinkled, damp-stained document. "We found it in Monsieur Dubois' study," the inspector said, "behind a painting. It's a will dated 3 days ago." Poirot raised an eyebrow. 3 days? Very interesting. And what does it say? Changes in the inheritance. Monsieur Dubois revoked control of the estate from Lucien and transferred it to Madame Elise. The silence that followed was like suppressed thunder. And did anyone know about this? Only the notary. The document hadn't been registered yet, but it's signed, sealed. It looks legitimate. Poirot nodded slowly. His normally gentle eyes turned hard. "Then we have a reason, a very strong one." The inspector said it bluntly. Lucien. It was that same evening that Poirot asked Lucien to accompany him to the greenhouse, the scene of the crime. The air was reluctant, but agreed. They walked in silence among the damp tiles, and tropical plants still dripping with dew from the irrigation system. "Why here?" Lucien finally asked. Poirot crouched down beside the stone bench where the body had been found. He touched the surface with 2 fingers and stood up slowly. "Because this place preserves the echo of the moment. And sometimes, sir, silence speaks louder than a scream." Lucien frowned. "Are you going to accuse me?" Poirot tilted his head. "And should I? I have nothing to hide. Not even that his father disinherited him 3 days before he died." Lucien took a step back. "How do you know that?" Enough to understand that his impulsive nature doesn't combine well with bad news. Lucien clenched his fists. "That proves nothing." "Perhaps not," said Poirot calmly. "But it is curious. His fingerprints were on the conservatory railing. One of the legs of the bench where your father died. It was recently broken. Someone could have pushed him." Lucien remained silent. It was at that moment that the gardener, a bent old man named Marcel, appeared from behind a row of ferns. "Sorry to interrupt, monsieur, but I found something. In the plants, behind the tool shed." He handed over a long object wrapped in a damp linen cloth. Poirot carefully unwrapped it. It was a dark wooden walking stick with a gold handle. Dry, no visible traces of blood. But in the centre of the wooden body there was a crack. "Another cane," said the inspector, who had just arrived. "That complicates things." "Or simplify them," murmured Poirot. "What do you mean?" "The cane found last night had blood on it. This one didn't. However, this one was clearly hidden. The other one was clumsily buried, as if they wanted it to be found." The inspector narrowed his eyes. "Are you suggesting that the first cane was a trap?" Poirot raised a finger. "I'm not suggesting. I'm just observing. And I'm observing that Lucien, despite his temperament, seems more like the victim of a trap than its creator." Lucien looked at him in surprise. For the first time in days, his eyes showed something more than anger. Bewilderment. "Are you saying someone wants to frame me?" Poirot stared at him. "My friend, in this house, everyone has something to lose. And when that happens, it becomes easier to place the blame on the loud-mouthed heir than on the silent culprit. That evening, at dinner, the atmosphere was icy. Madame Elise barely touched her soup. Cécile drank more wine than usual. Dr. Gautier leafed through an old journal without reading it, and Odette remained like a statue, staring down at her plate without looking up. Poirot watched. "Tomorrow," he said suddenly, "I'll do a little test." Everyone looked at him. "I've asked the photographer to develop an additional image that was accidentally discarded. Perhaps in it, the mysterious figure will emerge more clearly." Madame Elise seemed to pale just a shade. Cécile dropped her glass, and Dr. Gautier, for the first time, frowned deeply. Poirot stood up with a polite smile. "Good night, my friends." German well, and as he left, his voice was barely a whisper to himself. Someone, tonight, won't sleep at all. Chapter 5. The Psychological Game. The day dawned under a leaden sky and an unnatural calm. The Château du Bois, as if sensing the tension contained within its walls, seemed to hold its breath. Poirot ate breakfast alone, in the tea-room overlooking the conservatory. A perfectly laid tray lay before him. A croissant, black coffee, a slice of orange, and he didn't eat anything until he had aligned his teaspoon with the edge of his plate. Only then did he allow his mind to begin its play, not with evidence, with people. The killer, he thought, he's nervous, not because he left something unhidden, but because he left something too well hidden, too perfect. That morning, Poirot didn't request interviews or inspect crime scenes. Instead, he wandered around the house, unexpectedly appearing in unexpected rooms, making seemingly harmless observations and gauging reactions. First, it was with Cécile Morel, whom she found in the garden, smoking alone. "Mademoiselle," he said, affably, "your sketchbook is charming. I'm particularly intrigued by that figure in the bushes. Were you inspired by the photograph?" She tensed. "Which figure?" "The one in the group portrait. Didn't you notice it looks like the same pose as the one in your sketch?" She blinked, then looked away. "I didn't realize. It was just an imaginary drawing. I scribbled it while I was thinking." Poirot said nothing more. He simply nodded, bowed his head slightly, and walked away, leaving behind him a silence that weighed more than any accusation. Then he found the Dr. Gautierin Armand's office, leafing through a volume of old medicine. "Did you like the deceased's books, doctor?" "Some. Although Armand had some old-fashioned ideas." Poirot slowly approached the bookcase. "And yours? Modern? Experimental? It depends on what you're referring to. To medications outside the usual prescription range, for example. Undeclared painkillers." The doctor closed the book. "Are you suggesting that I drugged him? No, but you're the only one with free access to his medications, and oddly enough, the bottle of painkillers has disappeared." The doctor stood up. Sometimes the jars fall, break, and are thrown away by the servants. Poirot smiled. "Maybe, but it would be a shame if it turned up somewhere else. For example, in a drawer that doesn't belong there." The last word hung in the air as Poirot left without saying goodbye. Later, he passed by Odette Lefebvre, who organized books with trembling hands in the library. "Mademoiselle, you have an exceptional memory, don't you?" She hesitated. "I guess so. at least for faces. Poirot picked up a book at random. And yet, the face in the photograph seems a mystery to you, even though you might have seen it before. Perhaps in this very chateau. Odette blinked rapidly. No, I never saw him. Are you sure? Not even among the portraits hanging in the North Wing gallery? She opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped. A shadow crossed her gaze. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Sometimes the past hides in old frames, and he walked away. The last stop was Mrs. Elise, whom she found on the terrace, arranging a bouquet of roses. Her hands moved with precision, but her face was tense. A beautiful gesture, Poirot said softly. For your husband's grave. For the portrait that will hang in the main hall, he replied with a frozen smile. Armand would have wanted that. Poirot sat down next to him. Madam, do you think your husband died by accident? She was slow to respond. I don't know what to believe. This place, it changes people. It brings out the worst in them. And you? Have you changed? She looked at him coldly. We all did it. Poirot let the silence stretch on. Madame, do you know why your husband changed his will? She held his gaze, unblinking. Because, in the end, he realized that I was the only one who still cared about his legacy. And Lucien? Lucien only cares about himself. He's not cut out for this place. Poirot stood up, took a few steps, and turned to her once more. And yet they framed him with remarkable ease, as if someone knew exactly how he would react. Elise did not respond. That evening, Poirot met the inspector in the office. I've sown doubts, Binet, not to confuse you, but to observe what sprouts from the ground. And what has sprouted? Poirot narrowed his eyes. Fear, but not the fear of being caught, but the fear that something will resurface. Something that happened before Armand died, something buried, like that cane. The inspector tilted his head. And what do you propose now? Poirot looked at the unfinished portrait on the easel, where the deceased's granddaughter appeared half-drawn, with a barely visible shadow behind her. I'm going to show you a portrait tonight, not the one the photographer developed, an even more revealing one that will hang on your conscience. And with that, the little detective left. The game had already begun, and someone very soon would make a false move. Chapter 6. Another important revelation. Night fell heavily on Château Dubois, enveloping the towers in blue shadows and making the wood creak as if the house itself were whispering secrets. Poirot, from the gallery on the upper floor, gazed down at the main hall where the dinner would be held. Beside him, a servant was placing an enlarged photograph on the easel, the one the photographer Vallon had rescued from his discards. It wasn't the same torn image, but another one taken that same day, and it had its own peculiarity. The mysterious figure appeared again, this time more distinct, though still without precise features. Just a silhouette, a man with an upright posture, a hat and a cane, as if he had emerged from the earth, not by accident, but with the clear intention of witnessing the scene. Poirot observed every detail with surgical concentration. The figure was just behind Cécile, slightly out of focus, but undoubtedly present, The walking stick looked identical to the second one found, the one without any blood on it. "It all fits together too well," Poirot murmured to himself, "too carefully composed." Dinner began punctually. Everyone was present. Even the deceased's daughter, little Margot, had been brought by Miss Lefebvre, though she didn't say a word throughout the evening. Conversation was minimal. Cutlery clicked like nervous metronomes in a room filled with unspoken tension. Poirot, sitting at one end, let the silence drag on. And just as dessert was served, he stood up. "Mesdames and messieurs," he announced with implacable courtesy, "tonight I wish to share with you a new discovery." The eyes turned toward him. Lucien leaned back in his chair. Madame Elise held her fork poised. Cécile lowered her gaze. Dr. Gautier tensed his jaw. Poirot walked to the lectern, removed the cloth covering the photograph, and turned it toward the group. A murmur ran around the table. Some denied it, others froze. No one said a clear word. It was little Margot who broke the silence. "That's the man from the garden," she said in a low voice, pointing at the figure. "He told me I shouldn't tell anyone anything." A shudder ran through the room. "What are you saying, darling?" Odette asked, alarmed. She had a very soft voice, as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. "And she told me that if anyone asked, I should say I was alone." Poirot bent down to the girl's level. "When was that, Margot?" "The day Grandpa left me in the garden to talk to Madame Elise. Before the photograph." Poirot sat up slowly. "Thank you, little one. You've been very brave. The adults didn't know where to look." "So," said Inspector Binet, puzzled, "there's a witness? A real intruder?" Poirot shook his head with a calculated gesture. "No, mon ami, not an intruder. Someone known to this house. Someone who knew how to move around unseen, or rather, unrecognized. Someone who spoke to a child, believing she wouldn't understand the significance of what she'd heard." Their glances began to cross with more desperation. Poirot turned to Cécile. "Mademoiselle, can you tell me why this figure appears right behind you in both images?" She stiffened. "Don't know. Are you sure you don't know? You don't even suspect? I already told you I don't know." The scream echoed like a gunshot. Poirot remained unperturbed, curious, because the little girl recognized him, and not as a strange shadow, but as someone who spoke to her gently. Cécile looked at Margot. For a moment, something cracked in her eyes. "It wasn't what it looked like," he said finally, his voice trailing off. "I wouldn't hurt him. I just needed time to talk to Armand. I knew he wouldn't welcome me if I walked through the door. Because he discovered I wasn't just friends with Elise. I was something more. Many years ago, in my youth, my..." Frozen silence enveloped the room. "Do you mean that you and Mr. Dubois?" "Yes, I was his lover, before Elise arrived. I thought I could convince him to acknowledge Margot as his true granddaughter." Everyone turned to the girl. "What are you saying?" Madame Elise exclaimed. "That's absurd." But Poirot's expression was one of deep concentration, not surprise. "So," he said, softly, "you didn't come back on an artistic whim. You came back to demand. What exactly?" Cécile lowered her head. "True, and part of what Margot owed. But I didn't kill him, I swear. I just asked him not to make a new will." Poirot looked at her for a long time. Then he turned back to the group. "My friends, we've reached a revelation. A very important one. It's not the identity of the killer yet, but it is the truth behind the most powerful motive of all. The fear of losing a legacy, and the fear of sharing it." And as the room fell into renewed tension, Poirot knew he had tightened his grip. It was no longer a question of who had killed Armand Dubois. Now it was a question of who needed more than anyone else for the girl to never inherit anything. Chapter 7. Poirot's Hidden Clue. The following morning brought with it a heavy atmosphere, as if the chateau itself, exhausted by so many secrets, refused to fully awaken. The windows were covered with dew, the carpets muffled footsteps, and the portraits of the Dubois ancestors seemed to regard the occupants with silent accusation. Poirot, however, remained unusually cheerful. There was something in his gait, a barely perceptible lightness, as if the little grey cells had detected the last missing cog in the mechanism of the crime. After breakfast, he asked that no one leave the chateau. A simple precautionary measure, he explained in a calm voice. The time will soon come for us all to gather together and speak clearly. But first, I must revisit a corner that has, until now, been very little explored. Our emotional past, Inspector. Binet looked at him with a mixture of respect and frustration. "And what do you expect to find there?" Poirot smiled slightly. A reaction, a mistake, or perhaps a truth hidden not in words, but in what hasn't been said. While all the suspects remained scattered around the chateau, Poirot asked the senior servant to show him the family archive. He was led to a small room in the east wing, where albums, correspondence, and old documents were kept. He soon found what he was looking for. A letter dated more than 20 years earlier, signed by Cécile Morel, sent from Paris, in which she begged Armand Dubois not to abandon her after discovering she was pregnant. The handwriting was identical to that on an envelope found the night before, hidden in the false bottom of a drawer in the office. Poirot sat down with the open letter on his lap. Alors, Monsieur Dubois never publicly acknowledged it, but at least he wrote this letter back, and he silently promised to help. How convenient for some that this truth remained hidden. Returning to the ground floor, Poirot asked to speak privately with Odette Lefebvre. "Mademoiselle," he said in an almost paternal tone, "you have been the shadow watching everything. I know you have a sharp mind, and I think you know something more about the figure in the photograph." She hesitated. "And if I'm wrong, sir, then we'll just have wasted time. But if he's right, maybe we'll save a little girl from losing what's rightfully hers." Odette nodded slowly. That figure. There was something familiar about it. Not because of his face, but because of the way he walked. It wasn't Lucien, nor Valin. I think it was Dr. Gautier. Poirot didn't blink. "And why didn't you say it before?" "Because I wasn't sure. And because he was always kind to me. But now, after what Margot said, his voice, he has that voice. Low, soft, like he's whispering secrets in your ear." Poirot thanked him with a slight bow and headed straight for the gardens. He walked to the shed where the second walking stick had been found and began meticulously examining the ground. In a crevice between the stones, he found a small dark glass jar, hidden under a loose tile. It was empty, but when he opened it, the air took on a sweet, artificial aroma. He returned to the office with the bottle in hand. The inspector waited for him there. "A sedative," said Poirot. "Colourless, odourless when diluted, enough to stun. Not to kill, of course, but if mixed with a strong emotion, it can paralyse an elderly man, especially if he already has heart trouble. Do you think that's what they gave to Monsieur Dubois?" Poirot nodded, and the culprit made sure it looked natural. A fall. A scare. But it was all carefully staged, and now I know why. That evening, Poirot asked everyone to gather in the main hall. The developed photograph was on the table. So was the bottle. "My friends," he began gravely, "I won't reveal the killer tonight yet, but I will tell you something I've discovered, and I will ask you to confirm or deny it. If you lie, I'll know." Room was filled with tense glances. Cécile Morel had a daughter with Armand Dubois. That daughter is Margot. He hid it, but not out of contempt, but out of fear of scandal. Still, he wrote letters. He promised support. And 3 days before he died, he made a will to protect the child and her mother. Not only did he transfer the property to Elise, he also left a hidden trust for Margot, one that was to be activated with a doctor's signature, certifying the child's biological identity. A murmur broke out among those present. Poirot raised his hand. That doctor was Dr. Gautier. Gautier jumped up. "That's absurd." "It isn't," Poirot replied calmly. "You knew you had to sign, but you also knew that if you did, someone in this room would lose a lot. And then someone asked you for help." All eyes turned to Elise, but Poirot didn't point her out yet. "I don't know who convinced him, but I do know that you were the one who drugged Monsieur Dubois. And then you feigned surprise, and that you hid the bottle in the shed, the place no one would think to look, except someone who loves symmetry." Poirot clasped his hands. "And as you well know, I love symmetry." Gautier said nothing, but the sweat on his forehead was answer enough. Poirot looked at everyone. "Tomorrow I'll ask the final question, and only then will we name the killer." And with that promise he left, leaving behind a room choked with fear, and a murderer trapped on his last night of freedom. Chapter 8. The final meeting. The morning arrived with a deceptive serenity. The sky above Chateau Dubois was a clear blue. The birds sang as if nothing disturbed the countryside routine, and the servants resumed their duties with silent obedience. But inside the house, the atmosphere was tense, charged with bated breaths, evasive glances, and the imminent premonition of a truth that could no longer be hidden. Poirot, impeccably dressed as always, strolled through the main hall, lining up the chairs with mathematical precision. This wasn't a whim. For him, external order favoured internal order, and that morning he was preparing to unravel the final knot of the crime. At 11 o'clock sharp, the 7 suspects were summoned to the parlour. Lucien arrived first, his face serious, but without the usual fury. he was followed by Madame Elise, dressed in white, as if intending to convey innocence. Cécile Morel entered silently, avoiding eye contact. Dr. Gautier appeared serene, but his hands betrayed a trembling. Odette arrived next to little Margot, who settled into an armchair at the back, tightly clutching a doll. Finally, Edmund Vallon appeared with an expression somewhere between exhausted and expectant. Poirot stood at the front, next to the table where the photograph, the walking stick, the empty flask, and the letter found in the file lay. "My friends," he began in a calm voice, "this will be a different kind of meeting. I'm not here to interrogate, but to reveal. The murderer of Monsieur Armand Dubois is among you, and as is my custom, I will demonstrate it step by step." An expectant silence descended on the room. First, let's establish the facts. Armand Dubois had amended his will, one that not only disinherited his son, but also included a trust for his secret granddaughter, Margot. This posed a threat to more than one of us here. He looked at Lucien. "You had motives, monsieur, but not the cunning, and above all, not the medical knowledge to administer a precise dose of sedative. Then to Cécile. You had the truth, but not control of the situation. You tried everything legally. You failed, and you came here hoping to convince the deceased. You were an involuntary witness, but not guilty." He looked at Dr. Gautier. "You were the instrument. You prepared the sedative. You administered the dose, but not out of ambition, out of obedience." The doctor swallowed. Poirot continued. "Who did you obey? The one who stood to benefit most from Armand's death. Not Lucien. He was already out of the will. Not Cécile. Her hope was her life. The only one who had everything to lose if the truth about Margot became known was you, Mrs. Elise." All eyes turned to her with a collective vertigo. Elise didn't move. You feared losing your position, your inheritance, your control. You knew about Cécile. You knew about Margot. And you knew the new will listed her only as an administrator, not a direct heir. Poirot approached slowly. You convinced the doctor that Armand was losing his mind. You manipulated him into believing he was doing the right thing. And when the time came, you had him administer the sedative. Then you staged the scene to make it look like a natural death. Elise remained silent. "But he made a mistake," Poirot continued. "He didn't count on the photograph revealing a figure behind Cécile, a figure who had come into the garden not to speak to Armand, but to watch. And that figure was the little girl, Margot." An icy murmur ran through the room. "Yes," said Poirot. "Margot was there. She saw the doctor. She heard words. She felt fear. That's why she kept silent. Until the image was shown to her, and childhood memory, combined with a familiar face, said it all." Poirot paused for a final moment, looking at Madame Elise. "Do you want to say something, madame?" She held the detective's gaze. Her eyes were no longer cold, they were hollow. "I did it for justice. For the life I'd built over 20 years. Do you think I'd let an illegitimate daughter, born to a woman who appeared out of nowhere, inherit everything? Never. The ensuing silence was absolute. Only the ticking of the grandfather clock could be heard. Poirot turned to the inspector. "You may now proceed, Monsieur Binet." Elise offered no resistance as she was escorted from the room. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just walked with the intact dignity of someone who has already lost everything. Poirot approached Margot, who looked at him with huge eyes. "Don't worry, little one. Everything will be all right now." And with that gesture, the curtain fell on the mystery. There remained only one last thought, which Poirot kept to himself. Chapter 9. Revelation and Justice. Château du Bois awoke in a strange state of calm after the storm. The corridors that had been scenes of suspicion, awkward silences, and stealthy footsteps were now empty, as if they had exhaled everything they had concealed. Madame Elise had been arrested during the night. Escorted without resistance by the gendarmes, Inspector Binet had discreetly summoned. The scandal had not yet reached the press, but the feeling of a cycle coming to a close was already in the air. Poirot, impeccably dressed despite the hectic night, strolled slowly through the garden. At his side, Inspector Binet kept pace, with the expression of someone who has not yet fully assimilated the magnitude of what has happened. "I never would have guessed it was her," the inspector murmured. "She seemed so controlled, so serene." "Precisely, mon ami. The most effective poison is always the one you can't see," Poirot replied. Madame Elise had built her life on a facade of elegance, but a threat to her position, to her legacy, that unsettled her. And he used the doctor as an instrument. Naturally, Gautier considered himself her confidant. Perhaps he even harboured personal hopes. A well-spoken word, an insinuation disguised as a confidence, and voila! A man with access to medicine, ready to protect her from a family shame. The inspector shook his head. "And the will, it will be validated." Armand Dubois left sufficient evidence. Margot will be legally recognized as his granddaughter. And Miss Morel, as I understand it, will remain at the château to raise her. And Lucien? Poirot stopped. Lucien is a complex man, guilty of pride, yes, of rage, but he was also the victim of a more subtle manipulation. His fury was useful in diverting suspicion. Fortunately, he had the sense not to go beyond his words. That's a lesson life often teaches the painful way. At mid-morning, everyone was summoned to the library for the last time. Lucien, Cécile, Dr. Gautier, Odette, and the photographer Valin sat down, their expressions ranging from resignation to restrained relief. Margot remained in a corner, accompanied by her governess, leafing through a storybook, not fully understanding what was happening around her. Poirot took the floor. "My lords and ladies, now that the truth is out, all that remains is to put the facts in order. This crime wasn't committed out of pure greed, nor out of violent passion. It was the result of a mind that feared losing what it valued most, power and control." He turned to Gautier. "Doctor, you made a grave mistake, but you were also a victim of your loyalty. It will be up to the court to decide your fate. But if you wish to redeem yourself, you will have a chance." "What do you mean?" Gautier asked in a subdued voice. "You can testify as a key witness in the validity of the will. You can acknowledge Margot's identity as the clause required. That will at least repair some of the damage." Gautier nodded. his eyes glassy. Poirot turned to Lucien. "Monsieur, you won't inherit the chateau, but your name remains clear. And if Margot's future matters to you, as you're now beginning to show, you can contribute in other ways." Lucien didn't respond immediately. Finally, he said, "Blood is blood. Even if it's been hidden, it's part of us." Poirot smiled briefly. Then he turned to Cécile. "Mademoiselle, your struggle was silent. Now you must be firm. Margot will need guidance, protection, and clarity." Cécile stood up and walked over to her daughter. She hugged her silently. When everyone had left, Poirot remained in the library, alone. He stared at the photograph that had started it all. The mysterious figure was no longer an enigma. It was a symbol of everything that had been buried and had finally come to light. Inspector Binet returned to say goodbye. "Will you be staying longer, Monsieur Poirot?" "No. I've seen enough. This place needs to breathe without suspicion for a while." "And you?" Poirot smoothed the cuffs of his suit, satisfied. "I'll carry on, as always. But not without remembering what this house taught me. That crimes of the heart are the most silent, and also the most dangerous." And with that thought, the celebrated Belgian detective headed for the exit, his orderly figure walking away down the corridor of portraits as Chateau du Bois finally began to heal. Chapter 10. Conclusion and Epilogue. 2 weeks after the resolution of the Dubois case, life at the chateau had changed, but not disappeared. Like a stopped clock slowly resuming its rhythm, the corridors were filled with footsteps once again. The library was opened more frequently, and the greenhouse, where Armand Dubois' death had been discovered, was beginning to regain its original role as a sanctuary of flowers and calm. The most constant figure in the place now was Cécile Morel, who had serenely assumed her new role as the visible mother responsible for her daughter's legacy. Margot, although not yet fully aware of what it meant to be the heir, seemed less withdrawn, more inclined to smile at breakfast and run around the garden. The governess, Odette, remained by both of their sides, devoted but also discreetly, vigilant, as if still afraid the ghosts of the past would come knocking at the door again. Inspector Binet returned one last time to finalize the paperwork with the notary. The original will had been validated, and following Gautier's testimony, Margot's paternity was accepted by the courts. Madame Elise, after a full and detailed confession, had been transferred to pre-trial detention in Caen, awaiting trial. Her defense pleaded an emotional crime induced by psychological pressure, but even that wouldn't grant her leniency. Lucien, for his part, had left the chateau days after the arrest. He sent a brief, heartfelt letter to Cécile, acknowledging his kinship with Margot and offering financial help if they ever needed it. He didn't sign his name, just Lucien. At the Caen train station, under a slightly overcast sky, Hercule Poirot, he was waiting with his usual punctuality for his train to Paris. He was wearing his trademark pearl grey coat, bowler hat and cane, not out of necessity, but for aesthetic balance. At his side, Inspector Binet held a small briefcase containing the case documents. "I never cease to be amazed at how you've unravelled every layer of this crime, Monsieur Poirot," Binet said. "The motive, the method, the manipulation, all hidden beneath a traditional family facade." Poirot smiled softly. "The facade, my friend, is always what reveals the most. The obsession with maintaining appearances almost always indicates that something essential fears being discovered. This was no different. A woman desperate to preserve the order she built, willing to destroy the past. But the past, like a photograph, always leaves a shadow. "And what do you think of little Margot?" Binet asked, lowering his voice. Poirot looked out at the landscape that was slowly passing beyond the rails. A fragile flower, but firmly rooted. It will have a chance to grow. And that, Mr. Inspector, is the closest thing to justice we can hope for in this world. Binet nodded respectfully. And now, a new case. Perhaps something more trivial. A minor theft. A lie that's too simple. After crimes like this, one needs to rest one's mind, one's soul. Will you be staying in Paris long? Poirot smiled. Just enough time to polish my shoes, collect my thoughts, and visit an old friend in Montmartre who serves the best apple soufflé in the country. The train whistled in the distance. Poirot put on his gloves with surgical precision. "Goodbye, my dear Binet. Let the next time we meet. Let it be for dinner, not a corpse." And with that, he climbed into the car, took a seat by the window, and let the French landscape roll before him like a newly developed film. His eyes shone with the serenity of a duty fulfilled, and in his thoughts a new conclusion was already insinuating itself, waiting its turn among the folds of the future. Because for Hercule Poirot, crime could be defeated time and time again, but the human soul, that would forever remain his most complex case. In Chapter 11, The Echo That Remained. Although the Dubois case had formally come to an end, for those who had lived inside the chateau during the days of the mystery, the impact remained like a lingering scent, invisible but impossible to ignore. The days were calmer, yes, but also more fragile, and what Poirot had left behind wasn't just justice. It was a different kind of silence, one that forced the survivors to rethink who they were and what role they played, actively or passively, in the story that nearly destroyed a family. Cécile. She now spent her mornings in the library. Not to read, she still couldn't fully concentrate, but to look at the portraits, furniture, books, and objects that Armand Dubois had so painstakingly accumulated. Although she never publicly acknowledged him as a partner, Cécile was beginning to understand the complexity of the man who loved her, abandoned her, and ultimately tried to make amends. It took her several days to work up the courage to open the last envelope Poirot had left for her, sealed with his initials. She read it one afternoon while Margot slept. Mademoiselle Morel, crime forces us to look back. Justice forces us to look forward. But forgiveness is only possible in the present. Your daughter is the result of a silenced love. May she never again grow up in silence. H.P. Cécile folded the letter slowly, without tears, and put it in the jewellery box, which was now empty of monetary value, but full of memories. Lucien, for his part, had settled into a modest residence in Honfleur. The inheritance he had hoped for all his life had been denied him. But with that loss came an unexpected clarity. It was never the chateau he truly desired, but rather a form of validation that his father had never granted him. And in a gesture no one had anticipated, he wrote a second letter, this time to Margot, not his mother, with just a few lines. That you're recognized where I wasn't hurts me, but I don't blame you. I hope you use it well, that you don't become like us. Lucien sent it without waiting for a reply, and for the first time he felt he'd done something that wasn't born out of resentment. He Dr. Gautier suspended from his post-pending trial. He had abandoned public medicine. He took refuge in a small rural sanatorium as an apothecary's assistant without a license, without a name on the door. Everyone knew he had failed at some point in his career, but no one asked him why. And he didn't speak. He just took the prescriptions and prepared them in silence, with trembling hands and precise movements, as if each mixture were an attempt to cleanse the guilt of a crime he helped commit, even though he had never wanted to kill anyone. Odette Lefebvre, he remained by Margot's side, at least for a while. Although his role had been minor in the tragedy, his intuition was crucial, and that left its mark on her. Sometimes the girl asked him about Poirot, about the man with the curious moustache who spoke to her gently and truthfully. Will he come back? I don't know, Margot. He goes where he's needed. Then he'll come back, the girl replied confidently, because sometimes the truth hides again. Odette smiled, not knowing whether to correct her or not. And Edmond Vallin, the photographer who inadvertently captured the most lifelike ghost he had ever seen, hung one of the enlarged prints in his studio in Rouen. It showed no faces clearly, only the mysterious silhouette at the end of the garden, just before everything changed. He titled it The Nameless Witness, and when someone asked him about his story, he would simply say, "It was the image that resolved a death and saved a life." He never said more. He never said less. Meanwhile, in some discreet café in Paris, Hercule Poirot, he was flipping through a newspaper, his steaming cup of coffee perfectly centered on the saucer. In the provincial news section, a small column reported the official resolution of the Dubois case. The headline read, "Girl recognized as legitimate heir in historic court ruling." Poirot did not smile, but his eyes sparkled slightly. From his inside jacket pocket, he pulled out an unsigned postcard. On it, a little girl, drawn in coloured pencil with braided hair, and a clumsy dog at her side. On the back, written in a child's uncertain handwriting, "Thank you, Monsieur Poirot. I told you the truth, as you asked. Margot." Poirot placed the postcard between the pages of his book and finished his coffee. The world, that tangled labyrinth of human motives, always offered a new case, but every now and then it also offered a sweet memory. And as he walked out of the café with his cane gently twirling between his fingers, he thought, there are crimes that are solved with logic, and others only with compassion. Chapter 12. The Little Grey Cells. The evening light fell slantingly onto the platform of the Gare Saint-Lazare as Hercule Poirot, with his characteristically meticulous gait, stepped off the train. Paris lay before him like an old friend, chaotic in its beauty, immutable in its vanity. But that evening, even the City of Light seemed overshadowed by the memory of the Dubois affair. Poirot didn't head straight back to his apartment. Instead, he walked to a small park he frequented near the Seine. He sat down on a wrought-iron bench, took a small black notebook from his inside pocket, and began to write. Not a report for the police, not a letter to Scotland Yard. It was his own record, the silent diary where the small grey cells jotted down their final conclusions. The Dubois case wrote, "It was a mirror, not only of the suspects, but of myself." He paused for a moment and reviewed every movement of the investigation. Photography, an accident that revealed the presence of a silent witness. The blurred figure wasn't the key because of its identity, but because of its context. The shadow didn't represent the killer, but rather the game of appearances everyone was maintaining. The will discovered too easily, too opportunely. It was the thread that allowed Lucien to be accused, but it was also the trap. He was impulsive, yes, but not stupid. He had been used as a cover by someone afraid of being displaced, the cane with blood, carelessly buried. The killer wanted people to believe it was a violent death, but the real weapon was fear and pharmacology. Gautier, unknowingly, was the finger that pulled the trigger, although the bullet was emotional. The girl Margot didn't see a crime, but she heard a voice, and that voice, when repeated in Poirot's mind, was associated with a soft clinical tone, that of Dr. Gautier. The mobile as always, it was all about the psychology, not the money itself, but the power it symbolized. Madame Elise didn't want wealth. She wanted permanence. The chateau wasn't a property. It was her identity. Poirot slowly closed the notebook and looked towards the river. Everyone in that house was trapped in something. Their past, their pride, their secrets. But only one chose to kill to preserve a lie. As Dubois, she didn't poison herself out of hatred. She did it out of fear. Fear of once again being a figurehead in a house she'd ruled for 2 decades. Fear of being replaced by a child. Fear of being a footnote in a story she believed she'd played a leading role in. And as so often in his career, Poirot had discovered that the worst crime isn't murder itself, but the denial of the other as a human being. Elise didn't deny Armand's life, but Margot's. And so justice had to befall her. That evening, back in his apartment on the Rue des Petits Champs, Poirot carefully prepared his hot chocolate. He arranged his slippers on the sides of the armchair and put on a Viennese waltz record at a low volume. He sat down, squinted, and for the first time in weeks allowed himself the luxury of not thinking. And yet, a thought came to him anyway. Solving a crime doesn't always repair the damage, but it offers an opportunity to prevent it from happening again. That's enough. From his desk, he pulled out a sealed envelope. It was for Margot. Inside was a short letter. "Mademoiselle, never forget that silence can be brave, but the truth is what builds tomorrow. Be brave. Hercule Poirot." He placed it next to the other to-dos. Tomorrow he would send it. Tonight he would sleep. As Paris slowly fell asleep, an impeccably dressed figure with a symmetrical moustache and a sharp mind closed his eyes with the peace that only fulfilled justice can bring. Because on the grand chessboard of the human condition, Poirot wasn't playing to win, but to restore balance. And so, between waltz notes and the murmur of the city, the small grey cells finally rested.